It started as a promise that filled every parent's heart with hope. The HOA had finally agreed to build a much-needed playground for the children of the neighborhood. Everyone was ecstatic. Children dreamed of swings and slides. Parents envisioned a space for their kids to play safely. But as months passed, the construction site remained empty, with nothing but an overgrown plot of land and vague excuses. "It'll start soon," they were told. "Then, we're waiting on permits." Soon, those excuses became hollow, as parents began to wonder, why wasn't the playground being built? With each passing season, their frustration grew, and the community began to unravel. As whispers of financial mismanagement spread, a deeper, darker truth emerged. The board had more to hide than anyone could have imagined, and soon it was clear that the playground would never open. Unless they did something about it. It all started with a simple email that filled the neighborhood with excitement and hope. The HOA, after years of hearing residents' complaints and demands, had finally promised to build a playground. The excitement spread quickly, like wildfire across the community. For years, families had been asking for a safe space where their children could play, a place for them to escape the dangers of traffic and explore the joys of childhood. The neighborhood was filled with families, many of them young parents with children in tow, and for many of these families, this new playground was not just a request, it was a lifeline. When the announcement came, the neighborhood rejoiced. The email from the HOA was brief, but to the point. "We're pleased to inform you that we are starting the process of building a community playground in the center of the neighborhood, near the community center." The email mentioned a projected timeline for completion, which set the community buzzing with excitement. A park, a playground with swings, slides, and jungle gyms, children would finally have a safe space of their own. Parents started talking about it in the streets, at grocery stores, and at their kids' soccer games. Everyone had something to say about it, and everyone was thrilled. There were even some discussions on social media, where the community members began creating posts, tagging the HOA, and sharing their excitement. The promise of a community playground brought the neighborhood together in a way nothing else could, but just weeks after the announcement, things began to feel off. The lot where the playground was supposed to be built remained untouched. No construction vehicles, no workers, no equipment, only an empty plot of land filled with overgrown grass, some discarded trash, and a few patches of wildflowers. It seemed as if time had stopped. People began to ask questions. "What's going on with the playground?" someone asked at a neighborhood meeting. "Is construction starting soon?" The HOA had been pushing back the timeline for months, each new excuse just a little more vague than the last. "We're still finalizing the permits," they said. "There were some zoning issues, but don't worry, the project is moving forward." But as weeks turned into months, the community's optimism began to fade. The same empty lot remained, and the grass continued to grow, covering the patch of dirt where a playground was supposed to be. Residents, initially excited, began to feel like they had been lied to. The frustration was palpable in every conversation. It started with just a few concerned voices, parents whose children would ask daily, "When will the playground be ready?" Residents would smile and offer comforting words, telling the kids that the playground would be ready soon. But deep down they knew it wasn't going to be. The promises felt empty, and the more people questioned the HOA, the more they were met with vague answers that felt rehearsed. At first it was easy to ignore the growing sense of unease. It wasn't uncommon for construction projects to be delayed, especially when permits or unforeseen circumstances arose. So, the community waited. Some waited patiently, believing that things would soon be back on track. Others grew more skeptical. Why was this taking so long? Why hadn't any real work been done on the site? Where were the workers and construction vehicles? The neighborhood had been promised a playground, and yet the lot sat, untouched and unloved. By the time spring rolled, around the lot still looked exactly the same. The grass had grown taller, and a small family of squirrels had moved into the bushes. But there was no sign of construction, no bulldozers, no workers, no progress. The playground had become a distant dream, something that seemed increasingly unlikely. The entire neighborhood began to wonder, Was the HOA ever planning to build the playground at all? Rumors started to circulate. Maybe they're just dragging their feet because they don't want to spend the money, one resident said at a neighborhood meeting. They promised us this playground, but it feels like they've forgotten about us. The community was growing restless. No one knew what was going on behind the scenes, but something didn't feel right. Residents were growing frustrated with the lack of action, and they were starting to feel like they were being taken for granted. One evening, a group of parents gathered together in front of the lot where the playground was supposed to be. They stood silently, staring at the unkempt field, the grass swaying gently in the wind. "I can't believe this," said Jasmine, a mother of 2 young children. "We were promised something that's never going to happen." Her words hung in the air, echoing through the group. She wasn't the only one who felt that way. The neighborhood's excitement had turned into confusion and disappointment. What happened to the promise? Why hadn't the playground been built? Soon these concerns turned into open criticism. Parents began attending HOA meetings in larger numbers, demanding answers. They had been patient for months, but now they were angry. Every time they asked the HOA for a timeline or an explanation, they were met with a wall of silence. The excuses continued. "We're waiting on the contractor," the HOA would say. "The site is still being assessed." At first, residents held out hope that the situation would improve. They wanted to believe that the HOA had good intentions, that the project would move forward eventually. But as the weeks turned into months, their hope began to wither. The playground, once a dream, was now becoming a symbol of broken promises. The neighborhood was losing faith in the HOA's ability or willingness to follow through. As the summer approached, things only got worse. The community started to feel more divided. Some residents remained hopeful, choosing to believe that the HOA would eventually deliver on their promise. But others, like Jasmine, started to question everything. The trust was gone, and with it a deep sense of betrayal set in. For the parents, this wasn't just about a playground. It was about something much bigger. It was about trust, about the community they had worked so hard to build, and about whether the HOA had their best interests at heart. With each passing day, the sense of injustice grew. The parents began to wonder, had they been forgotten? Had they been lied to? And most importantly, what could they do about it? As they stood in front of the empty lot, staring at the weeds and grass, they knew one thing for sure: the fight was far from over. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. Yet the empty lot remained a constant reminder of the HOA's broken promises. It seemed like no one had any answers, and every attempt to get clarity from the HOA was met with vague responses and delays. As the residents grew more frustrated, some of them began to dig deeper into the situation, trying to uncover the reasons behind the stalled project. The promises of the playground had been so vivid, so filled with hope, but now all they had were empty promises and unfulfilled dreams. Jasmine, a mother of 2 young children, was at the center of the growing unrest. She had started questioning the HOA's motives. What was taking so long? Why hadn't anything changed on the lot? It didn't make sense to her. She had reached out to other residents, and it quickly became clear that this wasn't just a small group of disgruntled parents. There were whispers of financial issues, of something deeper going on behind the scenes, and Jasmine couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed answers. One evening, she gathered a small group of concerned parents in her living room. They sat around her coffee table, talking in hushed voices, their frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "I can't believe they've done this to us," said Marcus, his voice tight with anger. "We've been waiting for months. Why hasn't anything been done? We have a right to know what's going on." "I don't buy it," Jasmine replied. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "There's something they're not telling us. It's like they don't care about us anymore. But what's the real reason?" "I've heard rumors," said Carla, a neighbor who lived down the street. "Some people say it's because the HOA doesn't have the money to do the project, that they're just stalling because they can't afford it. But that doesn't add up. They've been saying they're waiting on permits, zoning and contractors, but there's no real progress." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had heard these rumors too, but something about them didn't sit right with her. Why would they announce the project if they didn't have the resources to complete it? She asked. It doesn't make sense. That's what I've been saying, Marcus exclaimed, his frustration bubbling over. They made all these promises and now they're just dragging their feet. But what if they had no intention of actually building the playground? Jasmine's eyes flicked to the window where the overgrown lot stood. She could see the empty space, now a symbol of neglect as it stretched out under the fading light. It seemed as though the HOA was testing the patience of the community, pushing them just enough to make them question everything. What if it's not about money? Jasmine asked softly, her voice tinged with realization. What if it's about something else entirely? Carla looked at her, her brow furrowed. What do you mean? I've been doing some digging, Jasmine continued. I found out that the HOA's president, Mr. Sullivan, has ties to a local developer, a big one, the kind that builds luxury apartments and commercial spaces in our neighborhood. There was a stunned silence in the room as the parents processed Jasmine's words. They all knew about Mr. Sullivan. He was the figurehead of the HOA, the man who had promised a better community, a more vibrant and welcoming place to live. But none of them had realized the depth of his connections. What does that have to do with the playground? Marcus asked, though his voice was less certain now. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper. I think this playground project is a cover. The HOA is delaying it because they're making room for new developments, big, profitable developments, and they don't want a playground in the middle of their plans. The room went silent. The idea seemed far-fetched, even outrageous, but as they sat there pondering her words, the more it started to make sense. If Mr. Sullivan was tied to a developer with big plans for the neighborhood, a playground could interfere with those plans. What if the land that had been promised for the community's playground was instead slated for something much more profitable? Jasmine's heart raced as the realization began to set in. The HOA had used the playground as a distraction. They had promised something the neighborhood wanted, knowing full well they had no intention of following through. It was a classic case of misdirection. If they really want to build these luxury buildings and turn our neighborhood into something, else they can't have a playground in the middle of it all, she said, her voice tight with anger. It messes with the whole plan. So they just promised us the playground, delayed it, and now they're hoping we'll forget about it. Carla shook her head, her face contorted in disbelief. This is unbelievable. How can they just use us like this? That's the problem, Jasmine replied, her tone hardening. They think they can just ignore us, lie to us, and take advantage of our trust. But we can't let them get away with it. We need to expose them. We need to show the neighborhood what's really going on. The room was filled with a renewed sense of determination. The parents had started as a group of frustrated individuals, but now they were united in a common cause. They weren't just fighting for a playground anymore, they were fighting for their community. They weren't going to let the HOA get away with exploiting them for their own gain. As the night wore on, they made a plan. They would gather more evidence, talk to more residents, and dig deeper into the HOA's financial dealings. They knew they were up against a powerful entity, but they weren't afraid. The stakes were too high. The future of their neighborhood and the future of their children was on the line. Tomorrow we start making noise, Jasmine said, her voice firm with resolve. We're not going to stop until they give us the answers we deserve. The group nodded in agreement, their faces set with a quiet determination. The fight had only just begun, but they were ready. The days that followed were a blur of research, phone calls, and late-night meetings. Jasmine couldn't sleep, her mind consumed by the thoughts of what they had discovered and what they still had to uncover. Every morning she woke up with a new sense of urgency, knowing that the clock was ticking. She had to expose the truth before the HOA got away with their plan. The group of concerned parents continued to meet, pooling their resources, and working tirelessly to gather more evidence. Jasmine had already made contact with a local journalist, someone who was known for digging deep into community issues. She had told the reporter about the broken promises, the playground, and the ties between Mr. Sullivan and the developer. It was risky, but she knew that if they were going to get the attention they needed, they had to go public. Each night after Work? Jasmine would sit at her kitchen table sorting through piles of papers. She had made a few phone calls to city officials, asking questions about zoning permits, land use, and any other details that might shed light on what was really going on with the lot where the playground was supposed to be built. What she discovered, however, made her blood run cold. The land wasn't zoned for a playground at all. In fact, it wasn't zoned for anything related to parks or recreational use. It was zoned for commercial development. The more Jasmine dug, the clearer it became. There was no intention of building a playground at all. The HOA had known this from the start. They had used the promise of a park to placate the residents, to keep them quiet while they quietly made deals with the developer. Jasmine couldn't believe it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. All along, the HOA had been playing them for fools, feeding them lies, hoping they would never question the promises that had been made. The playground wasn't an oversight. It was a strategy. A clever way to keep the community distracted while bigger plans were put into motion behind the scenes. The more Jasmine learned, the more her anger grew. The HOA wasn't just betraying the community, it was actively working against it. The neighborhood that she and so many others had fought for, had poured their hearts into, was about to be sold out for profit. Developers didn't care about the families who lived there. They cared about the bottom line, and they saw the neighborhood as nothing more than an opportunity for a lucrative real estate deal. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen. Jasmine had to take action, but she knew that if she was going to expose the truth, she needed more than just rumors and half-truths. She needed solid proof, and she was going to get it no matter what it took. That's when she learned something else. A few days earlier, Jasmine had attended one of the HOA's monthly board meetings. She hadn't gone with the intent to speak, but something had caught her attention. There was a new face at the table. A man who looked out of place. He wasn't one of the usual members, but his presence was undeniable. He had been quietly nodding along with everything the other board members said, but his influence was apparent. He had the kind of quiet authority that made Jasmine suspicious. Her gut told her that this man was connected to the developer, but how, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the timing of his arrival at the HOA was too coincidental. He had appeared shortly after the developer started showing interest in the neighborhood. His name, as she would later find out, was Jonathan Hillman. The same name she had seen in the zoning documents when she had been researching the property. It wasn't a stretch to think that Mr. Hillman had been planted on the board. He was the one making sure that things went smoothly for the developer's plans. He was the one making sure the playground promise would never be fulfilled. He was the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, keeping the residents in the dark. But Jasmine wasn't about to let him get away with it. With the help of the other parents, she began gathering information on Jonathan Hillman. They followed him, researched his connections, and spoke to people who knew him. They found out that Hillman wasn't just a businessman with ties to the developer. He was one of the key figures in the real estate group that was set to buy out the neighborhood. The pieces were falling into place, and the bigger picture was becoming clear. The playground was never about providing a safe space for children to play. It was about keeping the residents quiet, while the HOA facilitated a real estate deal that would change the entire neighborhood forever. Jasmine felt a wave of betrayal wash over her. She had always trusted the HOA. She had believed in their promises and their vision for the community. But now she saw the truth. The playground was never meant to be. It was a ruse, a tool to manipulate the residents into complacency, while the neighborhood was sold out to the highest bidder. But Jasmine wasn't the kind of person to back down. If anything, the revelation only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to let Hillman or the HOA win. She was going to expose them for what they were, liars, manipulators, and profiteers. She knew the fight ahead would be long, and it would be hard. But she had something they didn't. She had the truth. And with that, she had the power to fight back. The morning air in Crestwood Gardens carried a heaviness that residents couldn't quite name, but Jasmine knew exactly what it was. It was the weight of deception, hanging over every manicured lawn and neat row of townhomes. What had once felt like a tight-knit community was unraveling, and the playground that had been promised so many times had become the symbol of betrayal. For weeks, Jasmine and the group of parents had been quietly gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle of zoning documents, financial records, and hidden connections. The discovery of Jonathan Hillman's ties to the developer was the tipping point. Now it wasn't just speculation, it was proof. The HOA had no plans to ever build the playground. They had lied, manipulated, and strung along the families of Crestwood Gardens while working on a deal that would change everything. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Jasmine knew the HOA controlled the narrative. They sent out polished newsletters, posted updates on community boards, and held monthly meetings that felt more like scripted performances than opportunities for dialogue. If the truth was going to come out, it had to be louder, bigger, and undeniable. The first step was uniting the community. Jasmine understood that she couldn't take on the HOA alone. If she was going to win this fight, she needed the voices of her neighbors to join hers. She began by reaching out to the parents who had first rallied around the missing playground. They were angry too, frustrated by the constant delays and tired of watching their children play on cracked sidewalks instead of safe swings and slides. Word spread quickly. Jasmine hosted gatherings at her home, filling her living room with neighbors who were hungry for answers. Some came with skepticism, still unsure if the HOA could really be as corrupt as Jasmine claimed. Others came with fire in their eyes, ready to take action the moment they heard the evidence. She laid it all out for them. The zoning documents, the financial records, and the connection between Hillman and the developer. The room filled with gasps and muttered curses as people realized the truth. The betrayal cut deep. These were families who had paid their dues faithfully every month, believing those funds were being used to improve the community. Instead, their money had been fueling backroom deals. The anger quickly turned into resolve. Residents who had once been passive, trusting the HOA to handle everything, now wanted to fight back. They were tired of excuses, tired of watching promises evaporate, and tired of being silenced at board meetings. Jasmine could feel the shift in the room. The community was awakening, and there was no turning back. The group decided to take their fight public. If the HOA wanted to control the narrative, then the residents would take it out of their hands. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes, summarizing the evidence. Anonymous posts circulated online, warning neighbors of the HOA's betrayal. The whispers grew louder, spreading from house to house until even the most loyal supporters of the board began to ask questions. The tension came to a head at the next HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Normally, these meetings were sparsely attended, with only a handful of residents present. But this time nearly the entire neighborhood had shown up, and they weren't there to sit quietly. Jasmine could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she scanned the room, her neighbors filling every seat, lining the walls, their faces set with determination. The board members looked uneasy. Mr. Sullivan shuffled his papers nervously, clearly unprepared for such a large turnout. Hillman sat at the far end of the table, his expression tight and unreadable. The room buzzed with whispers until Sullivan finally cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. But the residents weren't there to listen. They were there to demand answers. One by one, voices rose from the crowd, cutting through the formal agenda. Where was the playground money? Why were zoning documents hidden from residents? Who was Jonathan Hillman, and why was he making decisions about their community? The board tried to dodge the questions, but the crowd wasn't having it. Every attempt at deflection was met with shouts of frustration. Jasmine could see Sullivan's composure cracking, the carefully maintained image of control slipping away. Hillman finally leaned forward, attempting to calm the crowd with vague reassurances, but his words only fanned the flames. It was Jasmine who delivered the final blow. She stood up, holding copies of the zoning documents and financial statements high for everyone to see. Her voice carried across the room as she laid out the truth, that the playground was never going to be built, that their dues had been misused, and that the HOA had betrayed the very people it was supposed to serve. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts and murmurs of outrage filled the clubhouse. Some residents stood in disbelief, while others demanded resignations on the spot. The board members sat frozen, their power unraveling before their eyes. For the first time, the control they had wielded so easily was slipping away, and they had no way to stop it. That night, Crestwood Gardens changed forever. The residents left the meeting more united than ever before, their anger fueling their determination. Jasmine could feel it. The tide had turned. The HOA had underestimated them, thinking they would never question authority, never dig deeper, never fight back. But they had been wrong. As Jasmine walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, she felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The battle was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. But for the first time, she believed they had a real chance at victory. The truth was out, and the community had finally found its voice. The days after the explosive HOA meeting felt electric, as if the very air in Crestwood Gardens was charged with energy. The silence that had once cloaked the neighborhood had been shattered, replaced by constant conversations, whispered strategies, and impassioned debates. Neighbors, who had barely spoken beyond polite greetings, were suddenly united, bound together by shared outrage and a common purpose. The secret that had simmered beneath the surface for years was now exposed, and the board members could no longer hide behind their polished updates or hollow reassurances. Yet exposure was only the beginning. Jasmine knew the HOA board would not give up their control easily. For years they had grown comfortable in their authority, believing themselves untouchable. Stripping away that power would take more than anger. It would require relentless persistence, organization, and a willingness to withstand the tactics that were sure to come. Sure enough, the retaliation began almost immediately. Within days of the meeting, the board sent out a newsletter filled with carefully crafted language meant to discredit the residents' claims. They framed Jasmine and her supporters as misinformed, accused them of spreading dangerous rumors, and even suggested that their findings were based on forged documents. The boldness of the lies was staggering, but Jasmine wasn't surprised. The board was desperate, and desperation had a way of twisting truth into something unrecognizable. But the residents had seen too much to be swayed by pretty words. For every misleading statement in the newsletter, Jasmine and her allies countered with proof. They handed out copies of documents, created group emails, and posted updates on neighborhood forums. Slowly but surely, they built a wall of truth that the board's lies could not penetrate. Still, the struggle took its toll. Jasmine could feel the weight pressing down on her shoulders each day, the exhaustion of balancing her family life with the fight for justice. Late nights were spent sorting through files, planning strategies, and calming worried neighbors. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe the board was too powerful, that maybe they would find a way to crush this rebellion. But each time, she reminded herself of the children, the ones who had been promised a playground, who had waited year after year for something that was never meant to come. The thought of their disappointed faces hardened her resolve. She could not let them grow up believing broken promises were normal. She could not let them think that power and greed always won. The real breaking point came when financial records revealed the full extent of the betrayal. A resident named Marcus, who had worked as an accountant, uncovered irregularities buried in years of expense reports. Money that was supposed to fund community improvements had been redirected, funneled, into vague consulting fees and administrative costs. When cross-referenced with bank statements, it became clear that thousands of dollars had quietly disappeared, lining the pockets of those who claimed to serve the community. The revelation was devastating, but also empowering. It was no longer just about a missing playground. It was about theft, deception, and a complete abuse of trust. The outrage spread like wildfire, igniting even the quietest, most hesitant neighbors into action. People who had once shrugged off HOA politics now marched into meetings demanding accountability. With evidence mounting and the community galvanized, the board's grip weakened further. Sullivan's voice trembled at meetings, his once confident tone replaced with nervous stammers. Other board members avoided eye contact, their guilt visible in every uneasy glance. And Hillman, the man who had orchestrated much of the deceit, grew increasingly hostile, lashing out at residents who dared to question him. His mask of calm authority was slipping, revealing the arrogance and anger beneath. Tensions escalated. One evening when the board attempted to adjourn a meeting early, claiming unruly behavior from residents, but the crowd refused to leave. Voices rose in unison, demanding answers, demanding resignations. The walls of the clubhouse echoed with chants, and for the first time the board was forced to face the sheer force of the community's unity. Jasmine watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The residents were stronger than ever, but she knew they were standing at the edge of something dangerous. The board would not go quietly. People like Hillman, who thrived on power and control, would do everything in their ability to hold on to it. There was no telling what lines they might cross to protect themselves. Her fears proved right when anonymous notes began appearing in mailboxes. Some were filled with threats, warning residents to stop before it's too late. Others spread rumors about Jasmine, painting her as an outsider who wanted to destroy the community. It was a cowardly attempt to sow division, but it rattled her all the same. For the first time, the fight felt personal. She worried for her safety, for her children's safety. Yet even as fear crept in, the fire inside her refused to dim. If anything, the attacks made her stronger. She realized the board was lashing out because they were losing. Their desperate tactics were proof that the residents' fight was working, and if they could withstand the intimidation, they could win. The climax of the struggle came with the call for a recall election. Fueled by anger and armed with evidence, the residents circulated a petition demanding the removal of the board. Signatures poured in, far surpassing the number required. For the first time in Crestwood Gardens history, the power dynamics were shifting, not through backroom deals, but through the collective voice of the people. The announcement of the recall election sent shockwaves through the community. The board tried to stall, claiming procedural errors and threatening legal action, but the residents refused to back down. The date was set, and the countdown began. In the days leading up to the vote, the atmosphere was tense, almost unbearable. Neighbors who had once smiled politely at each other now eyed one another with suspicion, wondering where loyalties lay. Yard signs appeared overnight, some supporting the board, others demanding change. The streets felt like battlegrounds, every conversation charged with emotion. Jasmine moved through it all with quiet determination. She had become the face of the movement, the voice of reason in a storm of chaos. It was not a role she had ever asked for, but it was one she embraced fully. Each time she thought of giving up, she remembered the promises that had been broken and the children still waiting for a playground. That vision carried her forward, giving her the strength to endure the sleepless nights and relentless pressure. By the eve of the election, the entire community stood on edge, holding its breath. The outcome would determine more than just who sat on the board. It would decide whether truth could triumph over lies, whether unity could defeat corruption, and whether Crestwood Gardens could reclaim the trust it had lost. For Jasmine, it was the final test of everything she had fought for. The morning of the recall election dawned heavy with tension. Crestwood Gardens, usually alive with children's laughter and the hum of everyday life, felt strangely muted. Neighbors walked to the clubhouse in near silence, their expressions caught somewhere between determination and dread. This was no ordinary vote. It was a reckoning, the culmination of years of mistrust, broken promises, and buried secrets. Jasmine stood near the entrance, her heart pounding in rhythm with each arriving resident. She had dressed simply in jeans and a crisp shirt, wanting to appear as nothing more than another community member, a mother, a neighbor, a homeowner who simply wanted fairness. But the truth was clear to everyone who passed her. She had become the symbol of this fight, the face of the movement that had dared to challenge the board. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with restless energy. The air was thick, the tension almost suffocating. Volunteers managed the check-in tables, while residents shuffled in and out, casting their ballots with a mixture of relief and suspicion. The CA. Board members sat stiffly in their reserved seats, their expressions masks of composure that cracked under close inspection. Sullivan fidgeted with his papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone who approached. Other members whispered nervously, among themselves. And Hillman sat rigid, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes hard and unyielding. For hours the process continued, each vote a small act of resistance, each ballot a symbol of trust in something better. Parents brought children with them, hoping they would remember this moment, the day their community stood up for itself. Elders arrived, leaning on canes or supported by family, refusing to be silenced. It was a turnout larger than anyone had ever seen for an HOA election. When the final ballots were cast and the counting began, the tension in the room reached its breaking point. The air was so heavy, it seemed to press down on every chest. People whispered prayers, clutched hands, and stared fixedly at the volunteers tallying each vote. Jasmine tried to remain calm, but her stomach churned with anticipation. She knew this moment would define everything: the future of the board, the fate of the playground, and the legacy of the community itself. As the last numbers were read aloud, a ripple moved through the crowd. Then it erupted, a wave of cheers, shouts, and even tears. The board had been voted out. By a clear majority, Crestwood Gardens had chosen change. For a brief moment, the room felt like it was vibrating with joy. Neighbors hugged, strangers clasped hands, and children jumped up and down, sensing the importance of what had just happened. The sound of unity filled the clubhouse, a sound that had been missing for far too long. But amid the celebration, the former board members sat in silence. Sullivan lowered his head, the weight of his failures pressing visibly upon him. Others slipped quietly toward the exits, avoiding the stares and murmurs that followed them. Only Hillman remained defiantly still, his eyes scanning the crowd with simmering rage. His power had been stripped away, but his pride refused to admit defeat. He stood abruptly, storming out of the clubhouse without a word, the slam of the door echoing behind him. The new board, hastily assembled from residents who had volunteered, wasted no time. Their first announcement was clear. A full audit of the HOA's finances would begin immediately. Transparency, they promised, would be the foundation of this new era. And their second announcement sparked cheers that shook the room. The playground project, long delayed and buried under excuses, would finally be built. For Jasmine, the news felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of joy wash over her. This was the victory she had fought for, the reason she had endured sleepless nights and constant attacks. Not for power, not for recognition, but for the children who deserved more than empty promises. In the weeks that followed, Crestwood Gardens began to change. The atmosphere was lighter, conversations easier. Neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion now worked together, volunteering for committees, attending meetings, and offering ideas for community improvements. The walls of silence that had divided them were crumbling, replaced by genuine connection. Construction crews soon arrived, their trucks and tools filling the once empty lot where the playground was meant to stand. Every day, residents gathered to watch progress unfold. Children pressed their faces to the fences, their eyes wide with excitement as swings, slides, and climbing frames slowly took shape. For them, it was more than a playground. It was proof that promises could be kept, that their voices mattered. When the ribbon-cutting day finally arrived, the entire community turned out. The sun shone bright, as if determined to bless the occasion. Jasmine stood near the front, her children at her side, her heart swelling with pride. The new board gave brief speeches about accountability and community spirit, but the real moment came when the ribbon was cut and the children rushed forward. Their laughter filled the air, a sound so pure and joyful it brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic adults. Jasmine watched her daughter climb onto the swing set, her face glowing with happiness. In that instant, all the struggle, all the fear, and all the exhaustion melted away. It had been worth it. Every battle, every sleepless night, every confrontation had led to this, the moment when the community reclaimed its heart. Yet beneath the joy, Jasmine knew the story was not over. Trust was fragile, and corruption had left scars that would take time to heal. The board had been replaced, but the lessons remained. Power unchecked could corrupt even the smallest of communities, and silence allowed injustice to thrive. Crestwood Gardens had faced its darkest chapter, and it had emerged stronger. The playground stood as a symbol, not just of childhood joy, but of resilience, unity, and the power of ordinary people to stand against wrongdoing. As the sun dipped lower and the playground filled with laughter, Jasmine allowed herself a moment of peace. She had not sought this fight, but she had embraced it, and in doing so, she had helped write a new story for her neighborhood, one where promises meant something, and where the voices of the people could never again be ignored. For Crestwood Gardens, it was truly a new dawn. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret. But remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.